Well, ladies and gentlemen, don't confuse me with John Lennon. And if I were lecturing in the Netherlands, I would be very tempted to say to you, vol verwachting klopt ons hart. But since I'm not lecturing there, I won't say it. It is an enormous pleasure to see you all this morning. And I must confess, the seductions of South Africa are rather impressive. And I have enormously enjoyed seeing the beautiful topography of your country, but much more than that, the people. I have been looked after by wonderful teams of people. And it is just so encouraging to see serious interest in God's word and the intellectual defense of the gospel in your country. That gives me enormous pleasure, and it's so good to see the attraction of the ideas as you've seen up on the screen. And I find this is happening all around the world, that particularly young people have got tired of the superficial materialism in terms of philosophy of their parents, and they're looking for meaning. And they're asking the big questions. And so I am very delighted to be here. I was told, of course, before I came that animals were all over South Africa. And I have seen white lions yesterday, but I've seen virtual elephants and virtual rhinos and virtual, in other words, they existed in the imagination.
Unsuccessful game drives is what he means.
They existed in the imagination of those who took me to these wonderful game parks. But it has been spectacular to see it. I'm only sorry that my wife was not able to be with me for various reasons. But thank you so much for coming. And I have enjoyed the company of this good man and his colleagues over the past few days. And now he appears to have a burning desire to grill me. Well, that's all right. It's breakfast time. And I'm looking forward to the interaction, as I have done all over South Africa, to the interaction with your questions.
Yes, John, thank you very much. It's just such an honor to be with you. I've get to know Dr. Lennox, Professor Lennox, the last few days. And let me tell you, one day when I'm all grown up, I want to be like this man. In a way that Paul says, follow me as I follow Christ. He's really an example. Sometimes when you know a celebrity or you know someone that you really look up to, and you get to know them at some stage, you're rather disappointed sometimes. With John, it was just the opposite. He's really an inspiration. So let's fire away. John, just a brief word of background concerning our situation in South Africa, and especially here, maybe in the eastern side of Pretoria. Our topic this morning is doubt and confidence. And there's an increasing number of people that testify to the fact that they've been in the church, they grew up in the church, and then they started thinking. They started questioning things. They read a book or two, maybe the God Delusion or maybe something else, maybe an agnostic kind of book. And they went to the church for advice or for answers. They felt that the church really couldn't help them. And in the end, they left their faith after a long journey of re-evaluating their own faith, struggling, questioning, and so on. So with that brief word of background, there are different reasons why people doubt and why people, in the end, disbelieve. And we'll get to that in a moment. But just a very general question first. What is the relationship, you think, between faith and doubt? And should doubt always lead to disbelief? Or is there a more healthy kind of doubt that might lead us to a deeper understanding of our relationship with God? Just in general, what would you comment?
The word doubt has several meanings, and that leads to a problem. When we think of doubt, sometimes we think of that sickening black hole feeling that everything is disappearing down the drain. That's one kind of doubt, and of course it's unhealthy. But in a sense, doubt in the other sense is the flip side of faith. What is faith? It is confidence in God and in His Word. And you're absolutely right. We've reached, in many parts of the world, a crisis of confidence. And as I look at that, I see that it's partly due to shame and partly due to fear on the part of Christians. And if I may add a little bit of analysis to what you said, because I think it's important for what follows, one of the deep problems is the double rate at which education proceeds. First of all, there's, for believers I'm talking, for Christians, that their knowledge of Scripture and the Word of God often grows very slowly beyond Sunday school stage, whereas their knowledge of their profession grows very rapidly indeed. And there comes a massive disparity in their understanding of the Word of God and their understanding of their profession. So when they are required to defend their faith, their colleagues notice the difference. They ask a few questions, the Christian collapses and is silenced. To add to that, there is the increasing peer pressure, certainly in my country, and I detected yours as well, to privatize faith. You don't do God in public. You just do God in private. And it is very interesting and indeed encouraging to notice that when the Apostle Peter talks in the famous statement that we all know, be always ready to give an answer to those who ask you a reason concerning the hope that is within you. It's usually quoted like that. But just a verse before it, it says, do not fear their fear. Peter encouraged believers to step into the public debate, realizing that the biggest barrier they would have to overcome is fear. And I would suggest, particularly to the younger people here, but not only to them, the biggest battle you've got is to overcome the privatization pressure and step into the public debate. And there is no other way of doing that but by engaging and getting involved. And it is a tragedy. In England, for instance, a recent survey showed that the main reason for people leaving church was this: they do not answer our questions. So that's how I would begin to look at that.
Okay, well, I think that's very important. And speaking of that, it's actually a question that I reserved for later on, but I think you mentioned it now. What mistakes have the church made in the past? It seems as though there is in the church, there's this massive intellectual renaissance taking place in science, advancement, and everything. But in the church, however, it seems like there's quite an anti-intellectual kind of culture. What mistakes regarding that have the church made in the past, and how do you think we can rectify that? If you can maybe just elaborate a little bit on that.
Well, I think the simple way is by ignoring Scripture. The very first commandment is love the Lord your God with all what? Your mind, soul, and strength. And the creator of the mind and of the galaxies and of the living cell is worthy of our mind. And unfortunately, there have been movements, theological movements, that have misunderstood that and have pitched reason against revelation, as if reason was somehow a bad thing. Now, I'd like to say something about that, because some people get very uneasy. They say to me, you're going around reasoning about the faith. Yes, I am, and Paul did it, and the Lord did it, and everybody else did it. But doesn't that lead to an idolatry of reason? It can do, ladies and gentlemen. It can do. How do you avoid it? By making a fundamental distinction. We either trust our reason and use God when we get stuck, or we trust God and use our reason. The latter is Christian, the former is idolatrous. And of course there is a fine dividing line. But we must not get into the foolish mistake of pitching reason against revelation and the work of God's Spirit. That's nonsensical, because you cannot read God's revelation in His Word without using your reason, can you? Of course not. Reason is a gift of God to be used, as distinct from being trusted, like all the other gifts we've got, our talents, our possessions. Gifts of which we are stewards. And the danger with every one of us is we trust them instead of using them. But once you sort that out, you can reread your New Testament and see that's exactly what the apostles did. We use our reason in every area of life, even in football. Isn't it such a scandal when Christians are not prepared to use their reason when it comes to the things of God, as if God wasn't interested in our mind? That's nonsense, ladies and gentlemen. And it's a wonderful excuse for being lazy, if I may be honest. I can be honest with you because I've never been here before. And I speak of
you're leaving again.
I speak of my own country and my own experience at home. So please don't don't take what I'm saying as a direct accusation. I'm simply making an analysis of what I observe to be the case, sometimes in my own wicked heart.
Okay, cool. Well, John, just one last question on this section maybe, and if you maybe can just keep it a little short so that we can get to the question, is do you sometimes doubt? And if so, what kinds of things cause doubt in your mind?
Well, let me tell you a story. My first week at Cambridge, a student challenged me and said at dinner table rather too loudly, "Do you believe in God?" And then he said, "Oh, sorry, you're Irish. I shouldn't have said that. All you Irish believe in God and fight about it." Now, I'd heard that before, but it was a turning point in life. I thought the one thing I've never been able to do in Ireland is meet serious agnostics and atheists. So I decided on that day to open up my worldview, my Christian worldview, to its opposite. And I've been doing it all my life. So doubt in the sense of facing the questions that people are asking, trying to sit inside the mind of my atheist and agnostic friends. And what I've discovered is that questioning process that I do all the time, and I've done it for many years, is the thing that has built up my faith. Because my faith strengthens as it's opposed to its opposite. If there's truth out there, and I believe there is, we need never be afraid of asking questions. So in that sense, yes, of course.
Sure.
Constant questioning my own faith and opening myself up to any kind of investigation.
Okay, and we can do that without leaving our faith or our faith being threatened. It
Yes,
actually
that's right.
strengthen our
Yeah,
faith.
sure.
Great. Ladies and gentlemen, what we are going to do with the Q&A is, John actually suggested it, and I think it's a marvelous suggestion. We have more or less 5 or 6 sections that we are going to try to cover in the interview. And we might not get through everything, that's fine. But in the end of each section, we're going to open up for 1 or 2 questions from the audience. John is going to write them down, and he's going to address 1 or 2 questions very quickly after each section. So concerning this section about doubt, faith or confidence, or even the role of the church maybe and where we messed up, are there any questions that you would like to put to John?
There's one at the back.
Moving into a secular society and very postmodern and pluralistic, how can we as Christians find security from the doubts of fear regarding the end times and the prophecies of Revelations? So kind of the security of the
Okay, so
troubles of the future.
what security does Revelation of the end times give us in this moving into the secular age?
No, moving into the end times, what
Okay.
security do we have from these doubts
Yeah.
that we are facing in our
Okay.
current
Okay, 3.
situation?
Okay, maybe a third one over here, Johan.
Professor, you're a scholar of a very exacting science, mathematics. How's that, if at any stage given rise to any doubts that you might have had regarding your faith, or how's that strengthened your faith in the studies of mathematics?
Okay, well, that's
2 or
3.
3 minutes.
Let's have a go at these questions very briefly. Objection to false Christian message. Yes, frequently. And we may get onto this later, but one of the main problems in debating atheists is not their erroneous concepts of some aspects of science. We need to start with their erroneous concept of God. Because the pitching of God against science is a result not simply of false analysis of science, it's a result of defining God in such a way that you pitch him against science. I can explain that very briefly. When Dawkins or Hitchens or anybody else meets me, they think that I believe in a God of the gaps. I can't explain it, therefore God did it. Now, if you believe in a God like that, then as science advances, God diminishes, by definition. Do you see that? It's very clever ploy. So they have defined God in such a way that science eradicates him, and then they said, therefore, there's no God. But half a minute. No sensible believer in God believes in a God of the gaps. They believe in a God of the whole show, the bits we understand, the bits we don't understand. And in fact, it's the bits we do understand that give rise to the greatest admiration. Because the more you understand of engineering, the more you can admire a typical German car, the Rolls Royce. And at least you're awake. And the more you understand art, the more you can admire a Rembrandt. Do you see what I'm saying? So that's true. The other thing that's true at this level is, of course, there are distortions of the Christian message. And this is a massive topic. The thing that is primarily misunderstood in terms of the gospel is religion, generally speaking. The proponents of any given religion will tell you that at its heart there is, in the end, an assessment by God on the basis of merit. Now, that would involve me expounding the New Testament, where Christianity, salvation, is not by our merit. And that is such a revolutionary concept that if people have never seen it, of course they will dismiss what we're saying on false ground. So misunderstanding of the gospel is a big thing. Now you talk about fear regarding...
Last question.
Oh, last question.
Yes, we should move on.
Well, I'll have to choose between the two. Talking about the end times really is not the topic for this morning. But, and I'd have to go into an exposition of that. Fear, I want to say a sentence about it though, because it's important. There are Christians at this very moment being subjected to torture. They're terrified. It's sad, isn't it, when we get a bit scared of some things that the New Testament says when we're living in comfort. We need to regain a sense of proportion with this. The Lord promised everybody that follows him that they will undergo persecution. Now, the special things to do with the end times we cannot cover now. A final just thing on the third question. I'm an exact scientist. I am. Pure mathematics is the most exact science there is. Does that lead to doubt? No. Not in the sense you mean it. Because you see, how shall I put this? The fact that the universe is in part accessible to mathematical description is one of the greatest reasons for believing in God. For a very simple reason. The atheist analysis is, here's a scientist like me, I do science with my mind. What is the mind? Well, it's the end product of a mindless, unguided process. Oh, really? If you knew your computer was the end product of a mindless, unguided process, you wouldn't trust it. Now, this is a very serious philosophical argument. Thomas Nagel's recent book, he's a leading American philosopher, Mind and Cosmos. It's got a startling subtitle for an atheist. Why the neo-Darwinian view of the universe is almost certainly false. And the point he's making in that book is this. Science has been successful. Naturalism has been successful because we've left out the mind that's doing the science. But the bottom-up explanatory power of physics and chemistry cannot cope with mind and information. And therefore, he says, materialism is in danger of collapse. So my chief gripe against atheism is this. It undermines the rationality I need to do science. So I reject it. And that argument has nothing to do with God. On the other hand, my Christian faith tells me that the reason that I can do science is because the God who created the universe out there also is responsible for the human mind in here. So Christianity gives me a coherent explanation. And if you look back in history, final point, the rise of science in the 16th and 17th century was arguably, in the opinion of most of the leading philosophers of science, behind it stood belief in a creator. So I'm not remotely ashamed of being a scientist and a Christian because Christianity gave me my subject.
Okay. Well, I think you've already moved into the second section, which is the whole part. I think one of the big reasons that some people doubt, or some reason that they use to explain that they actually doubt, is exactly the whole area of science, all the advancements. I spoke to several people that say, since the Enlightenment, there's been such advancement, new facts. have come upon the map. And we just cannot believe today in the same way that we believe pre-Enlightenment. And I've got 2 or 3 quotes here. A prominent theologian in our country, Saki Spannenberg, quotes scientist Calder by saying, until the 30s of the 17th century, the situation remained essentially unchanged. However, the trial of Galileo in 1633 then suddenly made clear the whole range of difficulties that Copernicus' discovery was to present to Christian theology. And then Spannenberg himself adds by saying, informed and thinking people know that the universe, the continents and life on our planet originated differently than what the book of Genesis tells us. So, and then of course, local atheist George Claassen, he's a scientific journalist, wrote a book with the title Faith, Superstition and Other Wishful Thinking. It's actually an Afrikaans title. You already partly answered this question, but is there anything you would like to add to these few?
A vast amount. What an insult to the medieval mind is that statement. This idea that the Enlightenment, the Aufklärung, this notion that people couldn't think before then, when you're simply ignoring thousands of years of some of the most brilliant intellects the world has ever seen. It's a false understanding, first of all. But secondly, I'm very amused to hear Galileo quoted. And I would love to analyze this statement logically, but we haven't time. Let's go to the heart of it. This idea that Galileo really showed the flaws in Christian thinking and all this kind of thing. Galileo was a Christian, ladies and gentlemen, in the sense that he believed the Bible and the Word of God before he started, and he believed it where he finished. A very brief analysis of the situation. The caricature is almost that you think Galileo was a great scientific atheist, the Christians were narrow obscurantists, and they believed that the earth was fixed, and along comes Galileo and he showed them that the earth was fixed, end of story. Well, just half a minute. The odd thing is that the first people to attack Galileo were the philosophers, not the Catholic Church. Because the philosophers since the time of Aristotle, the dominant worldview in Galileo's time in the academy was the earth doesn't move. And Galileo was challenging the prevailing worldview. Now, unfortunately, the theologians of the Catholic Church has jumped on the bandwagon, and they found convenient scripture to support the Aristotelian view. The earth is founded on pillars by the Lord so that it should not be moved. There the Bible says it doesn't move, so we all agree. So the point is this, it wasn't Christianity as such. It was a particular interpretation of Psalms linked to Aristotelian philosophy. So Galileo was challenging that, and he started the moving earth movement, which is now fairly considerable because I suspect that you are now, all of you, adherents of that movement. You all are moving earthers. And I could reflect on that in another context. But the point is, what you've quoted is a false reading of history. Now let me come to one more major objection. I said earlier that the definition of God needs to be gone into, but there's another thing. Why is it that Hawking and Dawkins and all the rest of them pitch God against science? There are more reasons than the one they gave. One, and the most important one, I think, for us, is a false understanding of the nature of explanation. Science is powerful, hence its authority. But we're not often taught at school that, for instance, Newton's law of gravity does not explain to you what gravity is. Nobody knows what it is. Newton's law of gravity gives you a mathematical method of determining accelerations of heavy bodies moving towards one another. But it doesn't explain in the sense of telling you what gravity is. So we need to be a little bit more humble. I've got a scientific explanation, therefore I know all about it. It's simply false. Secondly, there are different levels of explanation. And if I'm speaking to school children who often understand these things better than professors, so I'll do it that way now. If we have a Ford motor car here and you can see its engine, I say I'm going to offer you two kinds of explanation for the motor. One is in terms of law and mechanism, the law of internal combustion and clever mechanical engineering. The other explanation is Henry Ford. Please choose. And you say, but half a minute, that's an absurd choice, but that's exactly what Dawkins and co. are doing. They cannot make the elementary distinction that any sensible philosopher can make between an explanation in terms of law and mechanism on the one hand and an explanation in terms of agency on the other. And the explanation in terms of Henry Ford doesn't conflict or compete with the explanation, the scientific one. They complement each other. And the irrationality, the non sequitur logic of the new atheism goes like this. We have a mechanism and laws that do something, therefore you don't need God. But half a minute, the existence of mechanism and laws is not an argument for the non-existence of an agent who designed the mechanism. In fact, it frequently is the opposite. It's a very big argument for the existence of such an agent. And it's simple issues like this. It's not high recondite science that's the problem. It's elementary sort of school-level philosophy that these people have never studied and don't seem to have any idea of.
Ladies and gentlemen, are there any questions concerning this specific topic of science, atheism, and even new atheism maybe? Are there any questions that you would like to ask? And please just wait for the mic before you fire away.
Professor Lennox, are you familiar with the book of Russell Milton, Shattering the Myths of Darwinism, in which he argues that evolution is sometimes taken as, we now know that evolution is taken or considered to prove or disprove the existence of God. Are you familiar with his book?
Number two?
I read a book by William Dembski
Yes?
a few days ago, and there's a certain section about what we're saying now, science being a set of laws that it's actually experimental observations that more often you believe due to statistically 99% of the time, or that's how Newton's law was proven. It couldn't be, gravity couldn't be mathematically proven. Mathematics being the only exact science, as we said earlier. But with creationism, people who believe that the earth is only 6,000 years old, they try to explain the creationism in contrast to...
Okay, what's the question though? We need to get to the question.
What I was trying to say is, they try to bend the laws of science to fit their theory that the speed of light has changed over the years. So 6,000 years ago, that constant has changed. And then that's about the intervention of God that can bend or change the physical laws.
But what's your question?
Yeah.
Can you elaborate more on something like the intervention of God to change?
We're going to take only those two questions.
Well, I understand that the second question, which is a very big question, we're going to look at in a later section, so you just have to wait a little bit. The first question, Russell Milton and his work on evolution being a belief. Now, we need to unpack that a great deal, but I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to point out that, and it reflects on the point that the second speaker made, is this. Science roughly divides into two kinds. There's inductive argument, where you can do repeated experimentation, and if you've done the thing 100 times, you believe that if you do it 101st time, that you're going to get the same results. Now, there are problems with that, as a turkey discovers. If it has been fed 364 times a year, and then comes Christmas Day and it isn't fed, as Bertrand Russell notably pointed out, there are problems with induction. You cannot prove it, of course, because you have to assume it in order to prove it, and there are books, many of them written on it. The second kind of science in that sense is abduction. That is where we cannot repeat something. You cannot repeat the origin of the universe or of life or of many of the developmental stages that people argue exist. So you have to make an inference to the best explanation. That doesn't have the same authority, of course, as induction. And you rightly say that mathematics is the only precise science in that sense. All others, including physics and chemistry, you cannot speak of proof in the narrow sense, you can only speak of evidence. Now, having said all of that, the question of evolution, and Milton is an interesting character, it's a book that's interesting to read. The argument is that evolution can form a belief system. Now, in order to analyze that, we have to distinguish between 5 different forms and meanings for the word evolution, because there's a whole spectrum. There's evolution in the sense of Darwin observing variations. Well, that's not very controversial, because look around this room. Look at the variation in our appearances. They are a result of mutation and selecting going on. Even at a breakfast like this, you know, sometimes selecting goes on, but that's a different story. So that's non-controversial. The big controversial things are, of course, the question which interests me as a mathematician, whether a natural unguided process can create information. As a mathematician, I don't actually believe it can. The big problem with the topic, and this is a massive topic, the big problem with the topic, ladies and gentlemen, is it's the only branch of science that is very closely related to worldview. What I mean by that is this: there is no worldview from which you can deduce Einstein's equations or Newton's equations. But there is a worldview from which you can deduce most of the theories of evolution. Notice the plural there. And that is materialism stroke naturalism. If I put it to you like this: suppose there is no God, there's only mass energy. Please write me an essay on the origin of life and the development of life. You will come up with a theory of evolution, because it's the only option. And that's what Lucretius did centuries before Darwin. Wrote a brilliant book called De Rerum Natura, on the nature of the physical universe, where he got everything that Darwin proposed except the transmutation of species. He deduced it straight from materialistic philosophy. And that tells us this: the heat in the evolutionary debate today comes from that source. Because if it is discovered that the mechanism of natural selection, mutation, genetic drift, and a number of other things cannot bear the weight that's put on it, it's not now a question of simply finding another naturalistic theory, it's that naturalism collapses. And in this book, Thomas Nagel makes that point. And it is very interesting. There's a small number of voices, don't get this wrong, but very prominent voices who are saying startling things in the biological world, like Will Provine, Dawkins' opposite number in the States, who's written a big book on the power of natural selection and so on. He rewrote the foreword to it just recently, and he says natural selection does nothing. As a non-biologist, I find that fascinating. So there are all kinds of issues, but then, ladies and gentlemen, we haven't time. This is the thing for a lecture, and now a piece of shameless advertising. It's because I get this question so often that I wrote my book, God's Undertaker: Has Science Buried God?
Yeah, and unfortunately we don't have any of them here today. It's all sold out. John, we have a little time. Just one extra thing on this atheism. The kind of atheism present today is becoming increasingly aggressive and very, very vocal. Mm-hmm. And you've had experience in Stellenbosch, for instance, where one atheist stood up and yelled at you that you're a liar, and they're becoming quite adamant. How do you think we should? How should we approach it? How should we approach people with this view of science and that kind of aggression?
Well, that's easy to answer with meekness and kindness, because that's what Peter tells us.
Okay, well, that's
it.
We
must not retort in the way they go. The aggression is driven by dear knows what. Mostly ignorance, I think, and possibly fear, because there's so much at stake in this debate. And Dawkins recently said at a big rally in America, I'm not advising atheism, ladies and gentlemen. He said, I'm advising militant atheism. Mock them, and so on. And I've been the subject of some of his mockery, as you can see on television. The important thing is that one takes a lesson from the Lord in the way in which he handled people. The way you do it is just as important as what you do. And if you lose your cool in the heat of the kitchen, it's better to stay out of the kitchen.
Yeah, and let me tell you, John is a great example. He handled everything with such grace. and generosity. So just thank you for that example. But okay, John, we speak of atheism, and they're very vocal today. But underneath, maybe under the radar, there's a vast amount of people that also believe that to be a thinking person, that agnosticism is actually the more superior intellectual position. And it doesn't make more sense to say that, listen, to be humble, I mean, everyone today claims some kind of truth. We don't really know what truth is, and can we really know? I mean, surety is exactly that which cause problems. I mean, sure people don't take planes and fly into buildings. It's people with conviction that do that. So isn't it a better intellectual position to be humble and say, we just don't know what the truth is. The truth may be out there, like the X-Files say, but we would never know what it is.
I don't watch the X-Files.
Okay, so next question then.
The people who get their theology from Star Wars disturb me, but that's another story. There are, of course, agnosticism covers a multitude of things. I'm an agnostic about many things, about many areas of mathematics, astronomy, literature, philosophy, history. I'm an agnostic. I simply don't know. And that's why I'm interested in so many things, to reduce that agnosticism a little bit. But often today, it's not, I don't know and I'd love to find out, and have you any evidence that will help me? It's, I don't know and you can't know. Well, oddly enough, the two contradict each other. If you don't know, how can you know that I can't know? And logical contradiction is actually very important because it shows they're going too far. There are lots of things we can know. You knew that there was a breakfast at 10 o'clock this morning. And you knew it was truth. This idea that everything is relative is nonsense, of course, and always was nonsense. A friend of mine who's very perceptive has said people are usually only postmodern in areas which they consider unimportant. You never met a postmodern bank manager, have you? And so on. So the very important thing is, and it's interesting, the New Testament talks about it, speaking the truth in love and in humility. It seems to me it is perfectly possible to do both things. To say that we know no truth is simply nonsense. To say that certain things we don't know whether anything's absolutely wrong or not is nonsense. We all know that torturing infants is absolutely wrong. And that could lead to a big discussion as well. And there are lots of things we do know. Now, just probing a little bit beneath the surface of your question, that idea that we cannot know supposes, by definition, that there's no such thing as revelation. That this is a closed universe of cause and effect. But you see, the New Testament will contradict you full sword. It'll tell you that there's another world. And John, the apostle, will tell you these things are written that you might know. Let me give you a simple analogy. If you want to know me, you can put me under a scanning, tunneling microscope and attach electrodes to my brain and measure all kinds of currents and so on. You'd never get to know me. But if I start talking to you and reveal myself in language, you will get to know me. To a certain extent, you'll never know everything about me. My wife is still agnostic about many things about me, and I'm agnostic about many things about her. I mean, she is a wonderful mystery, actually, but there we are. You see, but then we know a lot of things. Now, if God reveals, let me put it this way. Francis Bacon, the father of modern science, used to say God has two books. The book of nature, we use our reason on it, and we come to know certain things in a limited way. And then there's the book of his word, and we use our reason on that as well. And enlightened through God's power and his spirit, we can get to know things about God. So one needs to watch that the agnosticism, which appears to be very humble, is actually an utterly dogmatic position, that naturalism is the reigning worldview, there's no revelation, and therefore you cannot know.
John, I hear what you're saying, and
Well, that's very good for a start.
I'm sure you're glad, but I'm not quite convinced. How do we know that we know something? I mean, I know you talk about revelation, and but still, that's still a position where you assume that revelation is true or is a possibility. How do we know that we know something worthwhile?
So you want a lecture in epistemology, do you?
Yeah, in
dear
30
friend?
seconds.
You're not going to get one, I'm afraid. This is a vast and deep question, and it is an important question. But the thing is, we come into the world, no one starts from zero. And there are certain things, although we cannot put our finger on them, I firmly believe that the real answer to this question lies in the fact that we're made in the image of God, a thing that's often left out of modern discussion for obvious reasons. And that at that level we reflect God in our capacity to grasp and think and know, etc. Although, when you ask, how do we know that we know? And how do we know that we know that we know that we know? And so on. It appears to go back forever. So to break into that, there have to be certain basic things. You have to start with things that are given. You notice the Bible doesn't start with proving the existence of God or even attempting to give evidence for the existence of God. It simply says, in the beginning, God. But then the rest of it, it builds up the evidence for it. So we take steps into our world, and the first things we don't get to know our parents by solving your question. We get to know them because we are capable of knowledge. Now, all these fundamental things. See, this question doesn't embarrass me because it's the same level as asking, if I were to ask you, what is energy or what is consciousness? We just don't know. But we use these concepts freely all the time, because at certain levels we can use them. That's all I'm going to say about it. If you want more, read a book on epistemology. And bless your hearts, I hope you're wiser after you've done so.
Okay, so the Christian worldview is an apologetic within itself. You understand it the best from within itself. Like C.S. Lewis said, I believe in God the same way I believe in the sun, not merely because I see it, but because by it I see everything else.
That's the best answer to your own question.
Oh, okay, thank you. I'll make notes next time.
Lewis, as usual, gets it right.
Friends, any questions on this? This is really a vast stream of thought in our Afrikaans society today. Any questions on this? Agnosticism, the whole idea of surety versus unsurety, and so on. There's a question, here's one, and we'll only have two and maybe three. With the mic.
Hi, John. It's Michael. I'm invisible to you, but I am really here and
Hello,
speaking
invisible
to you.
Michael.
Hi. I just have a question in terms of the law of non-contradiction and a lot of the methodology that apologists and ethicists use when they say A is not A. I understand how that relates well to a world of Newtonian physics, but when you go into quantum mechanics and Heisenberg's uncertainty principle and whatnot, can you maybe give a comment on relativity and how it relates to logical reasoning?
Not really.
Next one?
No. Michael's a very serious man whom I know. Michael, it's lovely to see you here. I'll collect the questions. Yes, I'm forgetting my own rule.
I was just wondering. Johan, down here are two guys here. Okay, we'll give the upper story just...
One, two. Professor John, putting forward an argument for a designer is a first hurdle, but calling that designer Yahweh instead of Allah or Krishna is another hurdle. So how do you argue for Yahweh with atheists? Because accepting that there is a designer, according to our beliefs, is insufficient. We need to accept that Jesus Christ is what we are proposing.
Okay. The question about, a very seriously important question about Yahweh and so on will come later, because he's planned it that way. The law of non-contradiction and quantum mechanics and so on. This seems to me, Michael, to be a very difficult thing, and I wish I knew more about it. Sir John Polkinghorne tried many years ago to teach me quantum mechanics. And reading Richard Feynman, I discovered nobody understands it. So to apply a theory that nobody understands to questions of logic is for me a little bit difficult. But I take your point that at the level of our normal life, we see that A is not A, and so on. But at the level of quantum mechanics, we have these very curious things where particles can be in two places at once, and so on and so forth. I really think the jury's out in this question. But I realize that I am not the size of a quantum particle. And so perhaps our lives function much more at the Newtonian level, because we are a massive object, so to speak, than they do at the quantum and relativistic levels. But I think the warning in all of that is this, that reality is always more complex and, for that reason, more interesting than we might think. You'd rather have a real Porsche than a toy one, but the real one is more complex. And so we need to be warned that reality, whatever that is extremely complicated. People often say to me that explanation must go from the simple to the complex, but I'm afraid quantum electrodynamics is not simple at all. So there's a warning there. But it seems to me again that God, having made us in our own image, and telling us in His Word that certainty, that knowledge is possible, that in the end, we've got to cut through the bottom-up explanations in terms of sorting out all our logic. I repeat what I said. You do not get to know your mother or your wife or your father or your friends by solving all the epistemological questions. You get to know them because you are a person. And it is very important to remember when we're talking about God that God is not a theory. There are many theories about God, but God is a person.
Good.
So we leave the other question to...
We do have some extra time.
There's one down there.
So we're going to have two more. Yes.
Is this, Professor Lennox, I recently read a book by Melvin Bragg, The Book of Books, which expounds the King James.
Yes.
And I was very impressed with the book, up to the point where he said that he was actually not a believer, that he believed in Spinoza's God, such as Einstein also believed. And I'd like you to just expound a little bit on the concept of Spinoza's God.
Oh, certainly.
Okay, we'll just have another question first. We do have some extra time, so that's a good thing.
Professor Lennox, I would like you to comment on, in your experience, would you agree that many agnostics claim to use science as a reason not to believe in God, when in reality it's actually an excuse not to believe in God?
Okay. Spinoza's God and the God of Einstein. The basic idea behind this is the notion held by a number of people that there is some sort of evidence of intelligence behind the universe. And even Richard Dawkins would go along with that a fairly long way. Einstein sometimes is misquoted by Christians, alas, as if he believed in a personal God, but he explicitly said he didn't. But then he's often quoted by atheists as if he was an atheist, and he wasn't that either. He believed in something beyond because of what I was saying earlier. Einstein was convinced that there's a fundamental faith that every scientist shares. That is, faith, confidence, belief, all the same, in the rational intelligibility of the universe. And you get somebody like Paul Davies, the physicist with whom I've debated. It's on YouTube. And he would say, look, there's tremendous evidence of intelligence out there. The fine-tuning of the universe and so on, its mathematical describability, its law-likeness, all point to a vast intelligence. But then comes the rub. What they will then say is this, but of course that intelligence may be vastly superior to ours, but it has come into existence the same way. In other words, if you take a vast universe that's 13.81 billion years old as of yesterday, because of the new results from the background radiation map that's been made, if you take a universe that old, well then there will have been intelligences that started evolving long before ours, and so they're superior to ours. But the crucial thing to realize is those intelligences are material, in the sense that they come from the basic stuff of the universe, it's mass energy. And I'll say something else about that. That's exactly the view of the ancient Greeks, the ancient Babylonians, the ancient Assyrians. They had theogonies and not simply cosmogonies. A cosmogony is the origin of the physical universe. A theogony is the origin of the gods. And the difference between Genesis and every other account from the ancient world lies precisely there. There's no theogony. God never came to exist. He always existed. And so comparing these, as we often do, or at least we don't often do, the atheists often do, is a mistake. Now, Dawkins, in the debate with me, mentioned this. And when I mentioned the resurrection at the end of the Alabama debate, as many people know, he was furious. You know, we've been talking about these great ideas, and now we come down to the resurrection of Jesus. How pathetic, how petty, how unworthy of the universe. Which is a very curious thing to say, because if Jesus rose from the dead, the shoe is entirely on the other foot. So that's what I would say about that. If you like to read Max Jammer's book, Einstein's God, you will get a lot of insight. It's a delightful book to read. Max Jammer, I think he's at Bar Ilan in Israel, professor of physics, has written a book on Einstein's God, which is one of the best on the topic. Then there was the question about many agnostics claim that science leads us not to believe in God, but they're using it as an excuse. Agnostics don't usually do that. It's atheists do that. Agnostics aren't usually sufficiently interested. It can be an excuse, but it's a very dangerous thing to assume it is an excuse, because you might be in danger of taking somebody non-seriously when they are serious. I meet many serious scientists, and they really think that science has excluded God because they've imbibed a whole lot of false arguments. And the only way to get through to them is to have serious answers to those arguments. You will never convince anybody by saying, your argument is just a bluff, it's an excuse for something else. Now, there does come a point when people, especially if they get angry and annoyed and irritated and can't see reason. I then followed the advice of an Irish farmer in my youth who gave me some wonderful advice. He said, if a person cannot see reason, reason isn't their problem. It's very good, isn't it? So, for instance, on that famous day in Cambridge, in my first or second week, when somebody challenged me and was very angry about me believing in God, I detected that they hadn't thought about it seriously. So I said, suppose I could argue to you right now, we've been through several arguments, that Jesus was who he claimed to be, would you be prepared to follow him? Oh, he said, that's just a problem. My parents rammed this stuff down my throat, and I don't want it. And I said gently, if you don't mind me saying so, I said, that's the first honest thing you said tonight. He became a Christian within half an hour, which is wonderful, and is still serving the Lord somewhere abroad. But you know, sometimes you have to gently get in under that. Because if argument goes on and people don't follow it, then logic isn't their problem. It's obvious. And, of course, we must recognize, ladies and gentlemen, that relationship with a person is very different from relationship with a theory. And it raises moral questions. And there are people who don't want there to be a God. And there are leading scientists who say, look, it's not my atheism that compels me in this direction. It's I don't want there to be a God. I find that refreshingly honest, because they're making a moral statement. We must realize that this whole area is a very complex mixture of science, philosophy, and morality. And if we forget the morality, we'll walk into a minefield without realizing it.
Well, I just want to say, I'm just so glad you get the questions and not I. Don't you think he's doing a marvelous job? I mean, that, and then he's humble as well. You know. Now, we decided that this morning is going to be a little different than all the other experiences or opportunities that John had during the rest of the tour. He's such a deep thinker on such a lot of levels. So, John, maybe a little a question that's a little more serious in terms of existential experiences. One major reason that many people don't believe is or doubt is because of stories of suffering or even personal loss. People maybe lost a loved one. A couple of years ago, you did a talk in New Zealand, I think in Christchurch, or just after that big earthquake in Christchurch, and you titled the talk, Why? I think in our country, we also experience some kind of suffering in the sense that we have some of the highest crime rates. People are victim to that many times. There's tremendous poverty and some senseless violence, like in a lot of other countries in the world as well. We've had the Oscar Pistorius thing, you probably know about that. And so it just seems so unnecessary, all these things. Why? What would you say?
I feel this problem, it's the hardest problem I face. And it's the hardest problem you face. And in a sense, it's the hardest problem atheists face. There are no simplistic answers to the problem, the twin problems of moral evil and pain. That is what we sometimes call natural evil. Brain tumors, tsunamis, earthquakes, and so on. So that's the first point to make. And the fact is this, we live in a world that presents a mixed picture. It's like Coventry Cathedral. There are traces of beauty, and there's evidence of bomb damage. And all of us have to cope with it. Now, because of my travels and interests, I've been in Auschwitz many times. And I've sat with many weeping Jewish people as they think about what happened to their relatives in Auschwitz. And I've always wept in Auschwitz. It's not a place where you can remain emotionally detached. So I feel the problem, and I face it all the time. I've just been in America in the Ivy League, and I think 3 out of the 6 universities wanted me to talk about this as being the major problem that students were coping with. And you know, let me illustrate it with a story, because you can philosophize about this for a long time, but I remember sitting a long way from here and a long way from home with a couple of Israeli engineers. They were very bright, and we were having breakfast together. And they discovered, because I told them, that I was about to give lectures on the book of Leviticus in the local museum. And they said, Leviticus? But you're not Jewish. I said, no, I'm not, but I'm going to try and persuade my Christian colleagues that it's worth taking this stuff seriously. So we started to talk. And eventually I saw them looking at each other, and they said, before we go any further, we need to tell you we don't believe in God. Oh, I said, I'd be very interested to know why. We're not going to tell you, I'm sorry. So we went on talking, and then they were glancing husband and wife at each other and came to a decision. He said, look, we are going to tell you, but don't blame us if it ruins your faith. And I said, and they meant it kindly, I said, if my faith can't face questions, it's not worth believing in, so go ahead. Okay, he said, we love reading. And Bashevis Singer won the Nobel Prize for Literature, an Israeli author, and he wrote a book called The Slave. And in it he describes how on one occasion in Russia, Jewish women and children were buried alive. And he said, as we read that, I don't know whether Singer said it or it was their reaction. When we read that, the light went out. There is no God. So he said, I'm very sorry, but that's where we stand. And I said to them this, I said, okay, there's no God then. You've solved the problem. That's how it is. And they looked at me very strangely. And they said, but you still believe in God? Yes, I do, I said, but I can understand why you say there's no God. So let's just look gently at what that solves. It solves your intellectual problem. The universe is just as it is, to quote Dawkins. No good, no evil. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. There's no ultimate meaning. But I said, I notice another thing. You haven't got rid of the suffering. It's still there. And in fact, you've got rid of another thing, hope. Because now you have absolutely no hope whatsoever. Because your atheist worldview means that death is the end. So there is no hope for these people. Secondly, you've got rid of the concept of justice, so that if they felt there was justice in the world, it has proved to be an illusion. So you got rid of a lot. So they said to me, how do you face this question? I said, with great difficulty. But you're going to have to take a journey with me that you're going to find very difficult. Because I said, to cut to the core of this, we can argue what a good God should, would, might, possibly, and we can all think our way, we think, into the mind of God, what he should be able to do, could be able to do, and all the rest of it. When we've finished 1,000 years arguing like that, we still are faced with a ragged, raw, bleeding, suffering world, aren't we? And none of us is satisfied with those arguments. Have you noticed that? When we get dissatisfied with arguments, we need to use that as an indicator that maybe we're asking the wrong question. So I said, since I can't solve those questions, what God theoretically could, should, and I would like him to have done, although I can see at the level of moral evil, as Lewis points out, that if God could have, of course, created a world in which there was no sin, by making you a robot, because robots cannot sin. They're not moral beings. But when I go home tomorrow, I shall be delighted my wife is not a robot. With an iPad now, you know, and a little thing that comes up, text, kiss, press button B. Well, you're laughing because you realize that there's no personal relational dimension. In order to have a relationship possible, you must be able to say yes and no. The capacity to say yes and no is the biggest gift we've been given by God. It's what creates the potential for A, morality, and B, relationships. Lewis was right in that, I think. But coming down to the quick of the question, and it is a big question, and I'm doing it very rapidly, and I don't normally do it rapidly. I say, since we cannot in the end solve all the philosophical questions, I have another question to ask. Is there any evidence anywhere in the universe that God can be trusted with the ragged edges? Now I said to these Jewish friends, I said, I'm going to take you on a journey that's difficult. Because you've now realized that I believe that Yeshua is HaMashiach. I believe he's the Messiah. Yes, they said, we do. Now, you find this difficult, but just come with me and try and come in your mind. I also believe he's the Son of God. And you know he was crucified. Yes, they said. I said, what do you think God was doing on a cross in that sense? And I said, you know, if that really is God there, God incarnate, do you know what it tells me? At the very least, it tells me that God has not remained distant from the problem of human suffering, but has himself become part of it. And at that moment, she burst into tears. And she said, why has nobody ever told me that about my Messiah before? I've had that experience several times. I do not think, ladies and gentlemen, there is any way of even having a window onto this problem without the cross. And it's that makes Christianity utterly unique. Jesus competes with nobody, because nobody offers us this. Now, there's much more to it. And because that is God incarnate, he rose from the dead. And that means that death is not the end. And it tells me, as Paul told the Athenian philosophers, that Jesus is going to be the judge. This is a moral universe. And justice is real. And therefore, even though on the one hand I have major intellectual problems with many questions, I think there's enough evidence to believe that when we see, now I'm wording myself extremely carefully, when we see what God has done with the innocents that have perished, we'll have no more questions.
John, thank you for that heartfelt answer. Maybe there's a few among you who would like Professor Lennox, who would like to ask a question concerning pain and human suffering. There's one there, Johan. Any more? There's one over there.
William Lane Craig, you know him, I assume.
Yep.
He breaks the problem of evil into intellectual and emotional, and I found that was a very good answer also, especially the way that he splits it up. And he says the intellectual problem of evil is nobody really tries to defend that anymore, and then the one that really remains is the emotional one. So maybe you could comment on that.
Yep. 2.
There was another one there.
My son asked me a question and I couldn't answer him. He said, if God is good and God is almighty, and he is, why does he, and he knows that people are going to choose death and they're going to choose the eternal hell, why does he make them then the people who is going to choose, who's going to burn in hell, basically? Why does he create them then?
Okay. 3.
There was another one there, over there.
From your experience, because of course you get thousands of questions here, you must answer to reason. So you talk to the mind. But from your personal experience, how do you convince the heart?
This is the last opportunity for questions. The next section, we will like to close just after the section without any questions. So this is the last.
Well, take the last question first. You talk to the mind, how do you convince the heart? Actually, ladies and gentlemen, for the past 5 minutes, I've been talking to your hearts. The dichotomy between the mind and the heart is nonsense. It's what we say addresses different things. You used your reason on what I was saying a few minutes ago, but I do trust it got to your heart. If a chap throws his arms round a girl on a starry night and says, I love you, her reason takes it in, but boy, is it an emotional experience. That's why the Hebrews didn't make such a distinction between the mind and the heart, and why we shouldn't perhaps make such a one. Bill Craig's point is taken, and if I had been giving a longer answer to the question, I would have said that there are 2 sides to the question. There's a problem of pain and there's a problem of moral evil, but there are 2 approaches of necessity. You see, cancer looks very different to an oncologist and to a young mother who's just been told she's 4 months to live. So there is the intellectual side in the sense of dealing with the argument and getting some understanding into it. I don't agree with Bill Craig, though, and I know him well, that it's not important. It is immensely important, because you see, sometimes if you are suffering, you need your clear, rational thinking to save your life. I remember meeting Jeffrey Bull, who spent 7 years in solitary confinement in China for his faith. I said, what kept you sane, Jeffrey? He said, a little bird that came through the window and sat on the edge of the window, and I could see the sheer beauty, the complexity, the wonder of this. That's his reason helping in suffering. And I just do not agree that it's purely an emotional problem, because you can't divide up so well. If someone is going through an emotional problem, you don't just play music to them, you talk to them. Of course you do. But it's what you have to say that registers, not simply in terms of desiccated logic, although that will be necessary, but a warmth of heart. And both are necessary. I have noticed that an eagle requires 2 wings to fly. Now, the question of your boy, why does God make people who create people when it's possible for them to choose death? Another of those difficult problems, but I've partly given you what I think the window into the answer is. God either makes a universe in which there's no morality, no trust, and people are just automata, not made in his image, or he makes human beings made in his image. Now let me give you a little analogy that will perhaps help you to face this. I have 3 children and an ever-increasing number of grandchildren. I don't know where my children learn this, but anyway, they do seem to be able to produce these kids endlessly. But I remember my first child, holding her in my hands in the hospital and realizing I'd brought her into the world. And she could grow up to say no to me. Why have children, ladies and gentlemen? If that's possible and happens many times. You know the answer to that. You see, we're made in the image of God, and that can help us climb backwards up and give us a little insight. I meet very few new parents who think in those terms, and yet logically it's perfectly possible. We think it's worthwhile taking the risk. God took a colossal risk, of course he did. I'm not denying that. So then the question is, has God made a big enough provision for when things go wrong? He has. But people can still refuse it. And then Lewis is very helpful. Here he makes the point, what would you have God do? For God to force people, you can't force people to trust you. That's the one thing you cannot do. God comes into our world and he goes into a village and he does wonderful things, brings sanity into people's lives, restores the dignity of women who've made a mess of their lives, and people look at it and they say, get out. What does he do? He gets out. He loves us enough, even though it hurts him, to accept our choice. And to choose not to have God in your world. And then in the afterlife to experience what it really means not to have God, because we get so many things from him, everything. Your cornflakes this morning, they ultimately come from God, your home, everything else. When all that is removed, of course it's terrible, but people choose it. And the trouble is we find ourselves wanting the impossible. We want God to remove their choice and to dehumanize them. Please let us not as Christians descend to the level of so many scientists today to tell us that we are just like the other animals. We are capable of personal relationships with God. Now, these are difficult questions. But it seems to me that Scripture is very clear. Isn't it interesting that the central statement of the love of God in the whole of the Bible is God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not what? Perish. In that maximally strong statement of the love of God, it says it's possible to perish. This may sound very crude to you. God can live with it.
John, I think we're nearing the end, and I think maybe a last question, I think that will also partly answer the question of our brother upstairs. Why Christianity? I mean, why not Buddhism, Islam, or Judaism? I mean, when I've told my wife often that, if I wasn't a Christian, I would probably like to be a Buddhist. From where I stand, they look like people that are really, that have high moral standards. They really pursue making this world a better place. And most of them, I think, are better people than I am. It's as though Buddha, sort of keep his disciples, his ducks in a row, morally, that is much better, with great respect, than it seems God does. So why Christianity?
There's my answer. Oh, you can't really see it, can you? It's not a wonderful drawing. And I'll explain it just in a moment. It's a very important question, and it comes almost in every lecture I've given here and anywhere else in the world. Because people can see, as you saw when you asked the question earlier, that it's one thing to say that there's evidence of designing intelligence, that there's a mind behind the universe, and so on. God of the philosophers, if you like. It's another thing to say that you believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. And that's what I believe, of course. Now, you cannot read that off the universe in the sense of looking at the science. Of course you can't. But then science isn't the only way to knowledge. History is another way, and experience, and so on. And so when you make a very highly specific claim that in space, time, and history God coded himself into humanity, in the person we've come to know as Jesus Christ, who lived, died, and rose again, then, of course, of necessity, you've got to draw your evidence from sources other than science. That's obvious. You have to do the same, incidentally, if you want to press the claims of any other religion. None of them are in the area, in that sense, of science in the strict sense. So now you come down to history, and when people ask me this question, I say, I know no other way of doing it than the way I do everything else. It's a matter of evidence. But then evidence is a broader thing than simply a set of logical arguments. My wife loves me, and I love her, but I couldn't give you a set of mathematical equations that establish that. That means it's uncertain. Yes, in the technical sense, yes, but I'd still stake my life for her. In other words, the point I'm making is that ordinary human experience, evidence can be strong enough to put your life on it. So just because I make a distinction between evidence and logical proof is not that I'm weakening things, I'm just being a realist. That's the first thing to say. So, assessing the evidence, there is a claim that Jesus came into the world. Now, of course, I was just thinking the other day, Richard Dawkins in his book and Hitchens questioned the very existence of Jesus, which is why I think they write themselves off as intellectuals. Because in the field, in the world in which I work, ladies and gentlemen, the cardinal sin is this. If you go outside your own field, as I've done all this morning, in case you didn't notice, if you go outside your own field, you check with the experts in the field. So Dawkins claims that Jesus didn't exist. Where does he get the information? From Professor G.A. Wells. He doesn't tell us that Professor Wells is a retired professor of German. If I got my information on biology from a professor of Chinese philology, he would take great exception to that. Who do you check with? The ancient historians. And I could give you a ream of quotations, but I'm not going to do it because they're in my book, Gunning for God. Why? There isn't a leading ancient historian in the world who doubts the existence of Jesus. So Dawkins simply refuses rational evidence which disqualifies his claim to be a person of reason. Just that as an aside. Now, we can check. We have to come first to the New Testament documents, but masses have been written on those. What people often don't realize is that they accept many classical writings like Tacitus, histories, and so on, without realizing that the first documents are written, and they're very few extant, written 700 or 800 years after the original events, whereas with the New Testament, we got, for instance, the whole New Testament going back to about 400. We've got bits of John's Gospel, 2/3 of it, going back to 200. And people say, oh, but they've been copied out so many times. That's just a failure to think. You imagine I'm holding 2/3 of John's Gospel, which is in the Bodmer Papyrus collection in Coligny in Switzerland. So it was written about roughly 200 AD. So it's now 1,800 years old. So it had been copied, how many times do you think? Thousands of times? Of course not. It might have been copied once. So in 2 steps we get to the modern day. It's just nonsense, this kind of argument. And actually we've got over 5,000 manuscripts of different dates of the New Testament, to say nothing of the 38,000 quotes from it in the early church fathers that would enable us to reconstruct it. The evidence for the authenticity of the New Testament is incredible, but people make wild statements without checking it up, so we can check those things up, so we're getting closer. And then we can come to the central claim, and that is that Jesus rose from the dead. That is the central claim. There would be no Christianity, as Lewis points out, if people hadn't turned up 2,000 years ago claiming that the tomb was empty. And we can investigate that. Now, this is such an important thing. And of course, it closes down science. I was on the Charlie Rose show not long ago with Richard Dawkins again, to my utter amazement, for an hour. And he came out fighting, as he does, and he said something like, well, this is John Lennox, and ladies and gentlemen, goodness me, he's a professor at Oxford. And he believes that Jesus turned water into wine. Goodness me, what is the world coming to? That was the implication of it, you see. So I said, stop right there, Richard. So he stopped. I said, Richard, you know, if Jesus was the Son of God whom he claimed to be, he'd already created water, so perhaps turning it into wine wasn't such a big deal. But then I said, Richard, we could talk all day about the miracles of Jesus. You wouldn't listen because you have an a priori rejection of the supernatural. You think that David Hume's definition of miracles is correct. Miracles are violations of the laws of nature. And therefore, you reject the whole thing. So no matter what I say, so we need to deal with that first. And Hume was wrong. Plain wrong, as his world's most famous interpreter, Anthony Flew, told me just before he died. Flew, written on Hume endlessly, told me that his books would have to be totally rewritten, and he feared he would not be able to rewrite them. He became a deist towards the end of life. And I can show that they're wrong. I did with Christopher Hitchens in about 3 sentences, because again, indebted to C.S. Lewis. I was staying in a guest house in Cape Town for a week. So on Monday night, I put 1,000 rand into the drawer. Tuesday night, I put another 1,000, so I have 2,000 in there. Wednesday morning, I wake up and there's 500 rand. Now, what would you conclude? That the laws of arithmetic have been broken, or the laws of South Africa? I'm glad you laugh, because it teaches a little lesson on the difference between law in the sense of jurisprudence and law in the scientific sense. But how would you know that the laws of South Africa had been broken? Because you know the laws of arithmetic. The idea that people were gullible and didn't know the laws of nature and so could believe in miracles in the first century is logically incoherent. It's sheer nonsense. Joseph knew exactly where babies came from. And when Mary said she was pregnant of the Holy Spirit, oh yes, and he wanted to divorce her. It took very powerful evidence for him to take her to be his wife. The blind man in John 9, as he pointed out hilariously to the religious experts, he said, look, from the beginning of the world it hasn't been known that a man born blind gets his sight. He knew the law, so he recognized the exception. Ladies and gentlemen, if Christians were claiming that Jesus rose from the dead by natural processes, then that would be a violation of the law in terms of experimental observation that dead bodies don't rise. But no Christian ever claimed that, so far as I know. I believe they rose from the dead by a colossal injection of God's power from outside the system. Science cannot comment on that. Science can recognize the regularities to which the universe works, which, and here's the irony of the whole thing, which we need to know in order to recognize that God has done something special. It doesn't violate any laws. He feeds a new event in. But now we come to the crunch, finally. That's one side of it. And in fact, in my new book, Gunning for God, I've tried to look at the evidence for the resurrection through the eyes of David Hume. So some of you might find that helpful. But there's another side altogether. And it's this. People ask me, look, why aren't you a Muslim or a Jew or a Buddhist and so on? Why are you a Christian? Now, that is a sensitive debate, ladies and gentlemen, that can generate enormous heat and hatred and even violence at times. So we need to remember a couple of things before we start. Firstly, I believe that every man and woman, no matter what they believe, is made in the image of God as a moral being and therefore of infinite value. If you don't let your friends of other religions know that, you'd better not talk on this topic that I'm about to enter on. Because one of the problems is that we talk about this topic downwards, and we don't communicate that we respect these people as people. But if they're made in the image of God, you've no option. Secondly, if you look around all the religions of the world, you'll find that although there are differences in morality, the central moral core is everywhere. The golden rule can be found in every religion and philosophy in the world, even atheistic philosophies. Why is that? Well, from a Christian perspective, it's because we're made in the image of God as moral beings. And that's why, not to put too fine a point on it, our non-Christian friends can sometimes put us to shame, ladies and gentlemen. Abram was put to shame by pagans in the Old Testament. To imagine that some of our unbelieving friends don't actually have a higher moral standing than we do is a mistake, isn't it? I didn't go into that in too much more detail. Because Christians I don't always keep the standards. I can let the standard drop. So having cleared that up with our friends from other beliefs and worldviews, we can now talk as man to man, so to speak. And then I say to them, now, there are differences between religions that all religions recognize. It's only the atheists, funnily enough, that want there to be just one vast religion. Leave Christianity out. Islam, with its belief in one God, will never agree with Hinduism or Buddhism. This is simply a fact. So we face the facts. Now, let me cut this short. Let's take the monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam. And let's take what we've been talking about, the resurrection of Jesus. My Jewish friends believed he died and didn't rise. My Muslim friends believe he didn't die. I believe he died and rose. Those three are historically mutually exclusive. So how would you decide it? Well, I know no other way. But facing the history, what does the evidence show? And I haven't had any difficulty in saying that to my Muslim or Jewish friends, because they can see the point immediately. But there's another level, ladies and gentlemen, and I close with this. If Jesus rose from the dead and is the Son of God, then we ought to take his claims seriously. And one of his claims is that he can be known. And that we can experience through trusting him peace with God, forgiveness. That we can, by repenting and trusting him as Lord, that we can receive eternal life. Now, of course, to an atheist, this is all nonsense, but half a minute. This is the claim. Does it work? Well, we can test that, can't we? Now, here is where Jesus is unique, because my little drawing, which you can't really see, but let me go through it very briefly, the idea is that religion as such, I'm told by its representatives, is a bit like a university course. There's an entrance gate by which you get into the university. Some initiating rite, an exam or something, and you're in. And then there's a path which for most people goes up and down, very wavy. And here we are, I'm on up at the moment, up and down. But unfortunately at the end, there are the scales of justice, otherwise known as a university exam. And you've got marvelous professors to help you on the way as you go up and down. But they can't guarantee that you get through at the end, can they? The kindest of professors cannot guarantee that you're going to get through at the end. Why? Because the basic principle is merit. You'll find that in every religion. In fact, many Christians sadly think that that is what it is. You get some initiated rite as an infant or a child, you're on the way, but of course the church can help you, or the imams can help you, or the priests can help you, but of course they couldn't guarantee you get accepted by God at the end, because it depends on your merit. Do you recognize that? Now comes the shock. Christianity does not say that. In Christianity, acceptance with God does not come at the final judgment. Utterly unique. It comes when a person receives Christ as Lord and Savior. He that hears my word, said Jesus, and believes on him that sent me shall not come into judgment, but is passed from death to life. Let me put this gently but firmly. Jesus isn't competing with any other religion here, because none of them offer us anything like this. He's not competing. And now, ladies and gentlemen, here's the interesting thing to me. That in our relationships with other people, the principle of merit would be an insult. Let me illustrate that as I close. As you know, I have a wife. I first saw her on day one at Cambridge. In church, actually. She was a marvelous vision. 16 years old, actually, but I shouldn't have told you that. And so I went to her eventually, and I gave her a wonderful present. It was a big cookery book. And I said, Sally, you know, I'd really like you to be my wife, but this book, as you see, is full of laws. If you want to make an apple cake, thou shalt take so many grams of meal, so many grams of flour, so many grams of sugar, thou shalt mix them in a bowl, thou shalt put them in an oven and heat it to 1,000 degrees centigrade, or something like that, you see. Now, it's going to be like this. I'd really like to marry you, you know, but of course I couldn't accept you now. But if you keep the rules of this book for, let's say, 30 or 40 years and do it pretty decently, then we'll have an assessment. And I shall decide whether I'm going to accept you. So will you be my wife? Well, I think the book would make a very big dent in my brain. I'm glad you're laughing, ladies and gentlemen, because that's exactly how millions of people think about God. Exactly that. It's astonishing to my mind that what would insult a fellow human being. Now let's go back to marriage. What is the secret of human relationship? It's that she accepted me at the beginning, for better or for worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health. It was unconditional. And that's what sets her free to enjoy cooking, isn't it? You imagine a wife under the first principle who decides to make me an apple cake. And she said, I'd love to make my husband an apple cake. But now as she's getting it into the oven, she suddenly realizes if she doesn't do it 100%, she's going to have to go back to her mother. And the tears blinding her, she turns it up to 3,000 degrees centigrade, and out comes a burnt offering. But it's not like that, ladies and gentlemen. Because my acceptance of her doesn't depend on her cooking. That's what sets her free to learn. And vice versa, of course. I often put it to audiences who see me traveling around the world, and they say, you know, you're doing a wonderful work for God. He must be very pleased with you, you know. Oh, wow. I say, look, if you think I'm going around the world doing this to get acceptance with God, you're making a profound mistake. I'm going around the world doing this because I've got the acceptance. That's the difference. And that's why I'm a Christian. Because no one else offers me that certainty, peace with God, forgiveness, dealing with the big questions of life, like sin, moral integrity. And therefore, ladies and gentlemen, I see no competition. I have friends in every religion and none. And I have no hesitation in sharing with them that message, which has brought such enrichment both intellectually and personally to me. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.